Honourable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to our government, to members of the Legislative Assembly and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Honourable members, please remain standing for the playing of God Save the Queen.
God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen. God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the Queen.
Honourable members, please be seated.
Introduction of visitors. Introduction of guests.
Honourable members, I understand that we have a special virtual guest tuning in today. It is a member, or a family member of the member for Calgary Klein, his daughter Eden, in her 6th grade class with teacher Miss Hayward from St. Margaret's School, joining us virtually this afternoon. I also understand that an hola is in nature, as it is a Spanish class today. Welcome to our assembly.
Ministerial statements. Member statements.
The member for Edmonton Rutherford has a statement to make.
Recently, I spoke with a 22-year-old woman who lives in Treaty 6, Victoria Love. She told me about the stress she feels being a young Indigenous woman growing up in the shadow of the legacy of murdered and missing Indigenous women. She spoke about the oppressive feelings that arise when day-to-day women from her community and across Canada go missing, and the response from authorities is passive and ineffectual. Cases are frequently left unsolved and families are left to grieve without closure. Victoria hasn't remained passive, however. She has shown powerful commitment to her stolen sisters. Upon hearing of the death of Caitlin Potts, who disappeared in 2016 without a trace, Victoria put in hours to raise $7,000 to hire a private investigator to find answers for the family. Victoria says that she is proud of what she is doing as one individual, but that she is disheartened that it has come down to this. She writes, quote, "The family and survivors need support from the government and police while they seek justice for themselves or their family." June 3rd is just around the corner. It has been 2 years since the National Inquiry put out their final report in the 231 calls for justice, and we've seen little to no action from this government. Where are the measures required to eliminate the social, economic, cultural, and political marginalization of Indigenous women and girls? Call number 1.3. Where are the well-funded Indigenous civilian police oversight bodies? Call number 5.7. Where are the necessary resources for specialized intervention, healing and treatment programs, and services and initiatives offered in Indigenous languages? Call number 7.5. I could go on, of course. There are 231 calls for justice, but the underlying question is, why is this government failing the thousands of women who have lost their lives? Why is this government failing Victoria Love and Caitlin Potts and all the young women who must grow up in the shadow of death and government inaction?
The honourable member for Calgary Klein has a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we announced what so many Albertans have been eagerly anticipating for months: the province's reopening in the wake of COVID-19. Albertans have come together in a remarkable way to crush the latest spike, both by following public health measures, but also by getting vaccinated in record numbers. The province's residents have stepped up to bring about what should be one of the best Alberta summers in recent memory. I want to give a special thanks to the many parents and teachers like Senora Hayward, as well as our kids who have stepped up in a major way recently with online learning, but also throughout this pandemic in their efforts to create a safe classroom experience. It wasn't easy, and we are grateful for you. Thanks to their efforts and the efforts of so many Albertans, we will be able to enjoy events like K-Days and Stampede. These events and other festivals are about so much more than just music, food trucks, outdoors, and sporting events. They're emblematic of the Alberta spirit and our Western heritage. Families and friends will be reunited over campfires and weddings, and we'll be able to enjoy our favorite restaurants in person again. Chambers of Commerce across this province have enthusiastically endorsed our government's plan that will allow for small businesses, the backbone of our provincial economy, to get back to serving customers again. Tourism, another critical sector, will also be revitalized by our reopen plan as Albertans hit the road to explore this province that we all love. Albertans have shown remarkable enthusiasm about getting the first shot. Nearly 60% have received one, and that's made all the difference in this province's incredible success in bringing down our COVID-19 case numbers. We need 70% of the province to receive a first dose by July in order to move forward. For all of you who have got the vaccine, thank you. And cheers to a fantastic Alberta summer.
The honourable member for Highwood is next.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday, April 23rd, I was thrilled to see the Minister of Energy take the podium to discuss the latest regarding Alberta's coal policy and our government's engagement plan. We are very lucky to be living here in Alberta, a place that has vast mountain ranges accompanied by beautiful prairies. These are two features of the province that everyone can agree is a point of pride. This ultimately has led to many Albertans expressing their thoughts about our provincial coal policy. Our government understands that Albertans have passionate views about coal development, both past and present, in our province. Fortunately, our government recognizes the importance of public engagement in terms of policy issues, and the recent coal policy engagement will allow all Albertans to express their thoughts on future coal development. I also want to thank every Albertan who participated in the survey, and additionally thank those who shared factual social media posts to inform Albertans about this important issue. The initial concerns of Albertans regarding our province's coal policy have been heard, and your concerns ultimately led to all coal exploration projects on Category 2 lands being halted immediately. The Minister has directed coal companies who are engaged in coal exploration projects on Category 2 land to stop their projects, and the companies have indicated their willingness to cooperate in this matter. This example of our government searching for public's engagement on policy issues within Alberta goes to show that our government has placed strong emphasis on listening to the public to ensure that our province is built on the interests of the people. I encourage all Albertans to stay engaged, not only on the coal issue, but all policy issues within our province. Please continue to stay engaged, because regardless of what you hear from the members opposite, we are all listening.
The honourable member for Edmonton Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today in this House, I rise to say thanks and show my gratitude to courage, resilience, and sacrifices made by thousands of Alberta's frontline workers and small business owners. I want to echo and highlight these hardworking Albertans' ongoing concerns and frustrations who this GCP government has left behind. While these hardworking Albertans were promised a lot in the form of provincial financial aid by this Premier, but his GCP government has repeatedly failed to deliver on its financial aid programs, including the Critical Workers Benefit and Small Medium Enterprise Relaunch Grant. Mr. Speaker, the selection process of the Critical Workers Benefit Program was a complete mess, as it picked winners and losers with no rhyme or reason. It is totally unfair and unjust to Albertans who got nothing while their co-workers received benefits or qualified for doing the same job. Instead of these benefits, fair selection and delivery process to these well-deserving Albertans, this failed program has added to the ongoing stress and risk in their lives. We all in Alberta, NDP, strongly believe that they deserve better than this. Similarly, while the Small Medium Enterprise Relaunch Grant's deadline has been extended until June 30th, this grant lacks accessibility. There are hundreds of business owners who are still waiting for a long time to evaluate their eligibility and haven't even received their first payment yet. These well-deserving Albertans, including hundreds in my riding of Edmonton Meadows, need the financial support to be immediately released into their bank accounts. Mr. Speaker, This GCP government must fix these programs and ensure that hardworking Albertans are not left on the sidelines from these benefits they need right now. The benefits they need right now. Thank you.
The honourable member for Camrose.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this month, nurses in Alberta and across Canada celebrated Nurses Week, which ran from May 10th to 16th. In 1985, the Canadian government proclaimed the second week of May as National Nurses Week. After a few years later, in 1993, the name was changed to National Nursing Week to emphasize the profession's accomplishments as a discipline. This year, the Canadian Nurses Association is using the theme, We Answer the Call, to showcase the many roles that nurses play in a patient's healthcare journey. This is an opportunity to celebrate the long history, hard work, and achievements of nurses from not only Alberta, but across Canada and around the world. Mr. Speaker, nurses hold one of the most important roles in healthcare. Over 35,000 nurses provide a service here in Alberta, and my daughter is one of them. Nurses provide critical healthcare supports, spending more time with patients than doctors. They care for the physical, intellectual, and societal needs of their patient. This pandemic has been hard on our nurses. I won't sugarcoat this. Nurses work long shifts, often later and longer than expected. They see individuals take their last breath. They see families grieve. They carry a burden that many of us would not be able to carry. The pandemic brought to light the courage and commitment that nurses work under each and every day, and conveyed the important role that nurses play in our communities. From day one, nurses were there, and they still are. In each nurse, we see a real willingness to help to calm the anxieties and relieve the discomfort of patients they treat. Nursing isn't simply a career. Nursing is a vocation. Mr. Speaker, I invite all my colleagues in joining me in recognizing the selflessness and courage of nurses across Alberta. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton West Henday.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin by thanking our teachers and education workers for everything that they've done for us through this pandemic. While this has been a rough year and a half for all Albertans, our educators have had to bear extra burdens, transitioning from in-person to online learning multiple times because this Premier has done nothing to ensure our schools are safely opened, coping with the mass layoff of over 20,000 education workers because the Premier and Education Minister decided a global pandemic was the time to cut supports from our schools, watching as the government seized control over their pensions without a word of consultation, forcing a curriculum on teachers because the Education Minister put the backwards views of Conservative insiders above ensuring our children can get an education that prepares them for the future, and so much more. And when teachers speak out against the shameful treatment and lack of respect from this Education Minister, they get dismissed as special interest groups, Mr. Speaker. This week, we learned that Edmonton Public Schools expects to see over 400 positions lost, including 357 teachers, 85 support staff, and 37 maintenance positions. The people who taught students during the biggest health crisis in Alberta history, the people who supported children, and the people who worked to keep our schools safe and clean are the first on the chopping block. This is not acceptable. The Education Minister cannot be allowed to shrug away these job losses caused by her total disinterest in supporting students. Edmonton teachers deserve better, Edmonton students deserve better, and Edmonton parents deserve better, Mr. Speaker. During a global pandemic and health crisis, Albertans sacrificed and worked to keep their friends, family, and neighbors safe and healthy. This Education Minister chose to undermine the system that she is supposed to protect. So before the minister claims that she's got teachers' backs or cares about them, I have a simple challenge for her. Prove it, because education workers just don't buy it. Thank you.
The member for Fort Saskatchewan-Vegreville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my honour to rise today to acknowledge Alberta Rural Health Week, which began on the 24th of May and ends tomorrow. Rural Health Week celebrates the contributions of rural health providers and volunteers who ensure that rural Albertans receive the highest level of health care locally. Rural health providers are essential in their communities. Not only do they enhance the quality of rural life through their skills and practices, but they also contribute to rural life on a more personal level. These individuals form special relationships in their communities. They do not merely provide healthcare services, but they are family, friends, neighbours, and volunteers. But, Mr. Speaker, Rural Health Week is not only about the healthcare providers who do so much for our communities, it is also about the countless number of volunteers who gave their time and energy through volunteering in hospitals, fundraising, and so much more. They are just as essential to rural health as the doctors, nurses, and other health professionals living and working in Alberta's rural communities, including those communities such as my constituency of Fort Saskatchewan-Bakerville. These individuals are the definition of what it's meant to be an Albertan: strong, compassionate, and resilient. This past year, it was hard for all the healthcare world, especially for those in rural communities, which is why I am so grateful to have the opportunity to stand here today and recognize the significance of Rural Health Week. This Rural Health Professions Action Plan is running the campaign titled #RuralHealthMatters, which aims to bring awareness to the significance of rural health care. I want to join all Albertans in recognizing this important week, and I want to thank those who have served and continue to serve rural Albertans in healthcare. Rural health matters. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I am so happy to recognize Evanston Creek Community Association in my riding of Calgary North for its dedication, hard work, and commitment to improving the quality of life for its people. I would also like to congratulate them on being a recipient of amateur sports grant for $50,000 through a partnership with Calgary Flames Hockey Club, Saladum Foundation, and Calgary Parks Foundation. These funds will be used to enhance the community rink and park. I am so proud of the outstanding support that this association provides to the community. I would also like to extend my sincere appreciation for all the community volunteers, including President Robbie Morton and his entire team, for their excellent services to community. The proposed park in Evanston Creek community will serve a population of almost 14,000 people. This park will play an integral role in enriching the lives of residents and will bring years of enjoyment for families in Evanston who presently do not have a park in their community. When I think of a park, I do not just think of a park, think of a jungle gym and swings, but a grassy area that children can play tag, hide, go seek, catch, and ride their bikes. In my view, parks aren't just meant for kids, but parents, adults, and seniors. Recreational areas are a great place to go for a walk and have a picnic. Everyone loves and appreciates recreational areas like parks, and that's why I am so glad that there will be a park in the Evanston community. My family and I are so eagerly looking forward to this community park in Evanston. Before closing, Mr. Speaker, I also want to let the residents of Evanston know that I will continue to advocate for a much-needed and outstanding middle school for your community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Central Peace Notley.
Today I rise to address a very serious issue, the public's loss of faith in the Premier. Let's wind the clock back to 2017. The creation of the United Conservative Party wasn't an accident. Its creation was made possible by tens of thousands of Albertans overruling the status quo of the day and demanding something better. More than any other political party in Canada, the UCP was conceived with the idea that grassroots, not a bunch of political insiders, would be in control. It was created out of a mutual commitment by all involved to get back to the core Conservative values that served our province well for generations. Some of the UCP's founding principles included protection of fundamental rights and freedoms, grassroots democracy, limited government, and fiscal responsibility, including balanced budgets and debt reduction. 4 years later, Albertans, both inside and outside the UC party, have serious questions about the Premier's commitment to those core values. This is why the party is losing members, losing lifelong Conservative volunteers, and losing donors. This is why the Premier's approval is among the worst in Canada, and it is why, if an election were held today, all polls show the UCP would find itself on the opposition side of the House. It seems that some want to hide their heads in the sand and pretend everything is fine. Some even go as far as to blame me for the government's problems, for daring to give voice to the public's concerns. But the problem started long before I spoke out. The truth is, I want Conservatives in Alberta to be united in our values and united goals. I want to continue to work at representing the good people that nominated me and elected me to the legislature. Ultimately, that's my job. I still believe this party can be what it was created to be, a vehicle that puts regular people, not political party insiders, in control. I believe it's still within us as Albertans to seize control of our own destiny. We can still be strong. We can still be free. But step one is admitting there is a problem. We have to be strong enough to remember who we are and where we came from. Most importantly, we have to get back to those core Conservative values that offer our province its best chance for new hope and new opportunity. Thank you.
Honourable members, oral question period, and the Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I have to start by clearing something up. We all want to reopen. And the Premier might be shocked to hear this, but we want his plan to work. We want birthdays, we want weddings, we want bar mitzvahs, concerts, patios. No one is cheering against this. But here's the thing, the Premier has been wrong twice now. Alberta families, investors, workers, business owners, and more deserve to know how the Premier is making these critical decisions. So, will he release the recommendations to Cabinet from Dr. Hinshaw, and if not, why not?
The Honourable the Premier.
The Leader of the Opposition knows perfectly well about the confidence of Cabinet confidential documents, Mr. Speaker. We had accepted the recommendations of Dr. Hinshaw, which was to fully reopen the province once we reached 70% population projection, which we are on track to do around the beginning of July. But the NDP leader was very clear earlier today. She wants to keep Alberta locked down until at least September. That means not only no stampede, Mr. Speaker, it means no Heritage Festival here in Alberta. It means no summer. The same party that wanted the schools locked down in the last year, that wanted to shutter most Alberta businesses, even if we get 70 to 80% population protection, they want an NDP lockdown. They're not going to get it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Most of what the Premier just said is not true. What is true is that this virus doesn't play by the Premier's rules. It doesn't care what day the stampede starts. So this must be based around science and evidence. Premier, 2 months ago, your benchmark for fully reopening was 150 hospitalizations and declining, a move supported by the CMO. Is the Premier telling us today that Dr. Hinshaw recommended a new hospitalization benchmark over 3 times higher than the one she released 3 months ago?
The Honourable Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, because the context has changed radically. You know, the NDP is starting to sound like the anti-vax party. They become the anti-science party. They refuse to recognize the enormous protective effect of vaccines. Mr. Speaker, 3 months ago, because of the federal shortcomings on vaccine procurement, we were at less than 10% vaccine coverage. By the beginning of July, we will be at 70% population protection. What does the Leader of the NDP not understand about the science? Why is she joining the anti-vax crowd, the anti-science crowd, and calling for lockdowns even after that's been achieved?
The Leader of the Opposition.
Why does the Premier continue to say things that are not accurate and undermine this very House by refusing to have an honest debate? When asked about the fact that the metrics had changed, the Premier said they're, quote, under the radar. Well, they should be under the microscope, but the Premier refuses to show his work. We have to take his word. Never a good sign, Mr. Speaker. To the Premier, poll after poll after poll says Albertans don't trust this Premier. Why won't he throw Albertans a bone and trust them with the very information he used to make these choices?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP is now trying to walk back their hard lockdown position. I guess they're starting to hear from regular Albertans. Just this morning, the NDP leader said, she was pressed several times, she finally gave an answer. She was asked, what's the timeline? How much longer would you be waiting to allow Albertans to do these sorts of things that we're talking about in July? She said, well, in BC, they're talking about September. Everything's back to normal in September. She wants every major summer event canceled, even after we have reached higher population protection than any jurisdiction in the world that's opened up.
The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Even when he uses quotes, he misrepresents, Mr. Speaker. Instead of passing sick leave, this Premier is checking boxes in a desperate attempt to hold on to his ever-shrinking base. One of those boxes is MLA recall, but even there, it's not as advertised. His proposed 40% threshold makes recall impossible, and the Premier knows it. Recalling the Health Minister, for instance, would require more signatures on a petition than there were people who actually voted for him. Will the Premier admit that his plan for recall is just another political gimmick and not a real tool for grassroots accountability?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, they flipped from being the pro-lockdown party to actually pretending otherwise. And now, after having spent her entire time in politics opposing recall, she pretends to be in favor of it. This is the leader who said, the NDP leader who said, quotes, she said the recall is just trying to redo the election, that they opposed it. They've always opposed it. Mr. Speaker, we're doing exactly what we committed to do. In the last election, we said that we would introduce a law based on the thresholds in the BC legislation and following recommendations of a legislature committee. Promise made, promise kept.
The Honourable Leader Opposition.
And the Premier knows, and all party committee heard, that won't work. As the Premier's popularity plummets, he keeps putting off his own leadership recall. So that says a lot about what he thinks about this issue. If the UCP won't give his plan some teeth, we will. Instead of the sky-high 40% threshold, one that's never been successful in any province or U.S. state in the last decade, we are proposing 25%. Much more attainable, even, say, with the health minister. Will the Premier lower this threshold, or is he more afraid of Albertans who are wanting to recall his MLAs?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it's the NDP that's afraid of recall. The Leader of the Opposition said, quotes, recall sounds good in theory, but it actually can be very disruptive and often exploitative. That's what she said. She's opposed to it. This is a phony amendment. Mr. Speaker, we ran on an explicit commitment to adopt the recall thresholds proposed in British Columbia. That's exactly what we are doing. And by the way, the BC NDP brought that law in, and it was effective in forcing a disgraced MLA to resign, just as this will be important accountability for Alberta voters.
The Leader of the Opposition.
People heard the Premier's promise in the last election, they thought it would happen in his term. As suspected, though, it's just another cheap political stunt from this Premier. So much so, he can't even commit to have his plan in place this term, meaning nobody in this House will face recall if the Premier gets his way. We're proposing that not happen, that it be proclaimed the end of July. I know there's a lot of Albertans who would be super happy to be lining up to use this tool, and if the Premier's true to his word, it should make him happy too. So, Mr. Speaker, what exactly is the problem for the Premier? What's he afraid of?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is unbelievable. The NDP that has always opposed recall, that has been delaying it and voting against it in the House, suddenly asks that it be accelerated. Mr. Speaker, we're ready to vote on it in third reading this afternoon. Let's get her done, Mr. Speaker. Let's bring in this accountability that they oppose. Mr. Speaker, let us implement this campaign commitment that this party gave to Albertans, which is before the legislature, to allow recalls to begin later this year. Mr. Speaker, I know she's angry. Maybe that's because she'll get recalled.
Order. Order. The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Mr. Speaker, the UCP government introduced recall legislation, but it's toothless and fake. I hear from Albertans every day who are fed up with this Premier, and the polling suggests he's the least trusted in all of Canada. Premier, is the reason you won't bring real recall legislation to Alberta because you know many of your MLAs, including yourself, would be at risk of losing their seats in this legislature.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, let me quote the Leader of the NDP on recall, saying in 2016 that this means that if you don't like the results, then let's come up with something else just to simply hijack the process. They have been, the member who just asked that question voted against the recall law. They have been trying to delay the recall law. Mr. Speaker, this is an important democratic reform that we committed to. It is exactly the details that we committed to. We said in our platform, a bill that would allow voters to force a by-election if 40% of eligible voters sign a recall petition sooner than 18 months after an election. Exactly what we're doing.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier's recall bill requires 2 votes to remove an MLA from this House, but only 1 to reject a city councillor or school trustee. It would appear this Premier has built a fail-safe so that none of his MLA would ever be recalled. I'm bringing an amendment to remove the second vote and to make it so all elected officials are subjected to same consistent rule. Will the Premier support my amendment, or will he continue to hide behind 2 recall votes?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, part of our platform commitment was to invite a legislature committee to study the concept of recall and to make recommendations, and they recommended exactly this provision. Now, I know that the NDP totally disrespects the views of private members, but, Mr. Speaker, we respect the hard and diligent work of the legislature committee. We're keeping exactly the commitment we gave to Albertans, and in fact, the NDP doesn't want school trustees and municipal councillors to be subject to this democratic accountability. They're wrong. We're going to bring that into the law.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Speaking of accountability, Mr. Speaker, 99% of teachers voted in support of a no-confidence motion against the UCP's education minister. 98% of doctors say they don't trust the health minister. If the Premier is really wanting Albertans to have their say, if he really wants to show that he is accountable to Albertans, why won't he start with removing both the ministers and then passing a real recall legislation that gives Albertans a real tool to hold him and his government accountable?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we all know that the NDP is bought and paid for by big government unions. They exist for one reason, Mr. Speaker, which is to be the mouthpiece of big government unions. But I've got news for them, Mr. Speaker. Alberta is not a unionocracy, it is a democracy. The leader of the Minister of Education was elected by her Red Deer North constituents. She has the complete confidence of this government. And I will point out that former Education Minister Jeff Johnson achieved a 100% non-confidence vote from the ATA. My question for our minister is what is she doing wrong?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Last night, the government rammed Bill 64 through this House, allowing it to impose a $90 fee on Alberta families visiting Kananaskis, a treasured park that had been free for 50 years. The government has claimed that the money they're draining from household budgets will be put back into the park to help with staffing, operations, and maintenance. Wanting to keep this government honest, Alberta's NDP proposed an amendment that would ensure that all the revenue actually went back into K-Country. It was voted down by the government. How can the least trusted Premier in Canada actually expect Albertans to believe that he will put the revenue earned from this ridiculous new fee back into K-Country?
The Honourable Premier.
Because it's already in the law. It's enshrined in the Treasury Board process. This is a designated, dedicated source of revenue that will go to make critical and historic investments to renew K-Country for the future after the NDP neglected it. You know, Mr. Speaker, you have to pay to go into any national park in this country, but we have more traffic, more visits to K-Country than Banff or Jasper. We need to provide the services, the infrastructure to guarantee the future, to conserve our natural environment, and a reasonable fee is a reasonable way of doing so.
Here, here. Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Well, I challenge the Premier to show the people of Alberta where in law it says that the fee is dedicated revenue, because it's not there. Albertans were shocked when they uncovered a plan early in this government's mandate to sell off dozens of our treasured parks. Thankfully, Albertans spoke out loud and clear in support of protecting and preserving our beautiful natural areas. I still have Defend Alberta Park signs all over my neighbourhood. They send a clear message to this minister that Alberta parks aren't for sale, certainly not without proper consultation. Will the Premier concede to Albertans that he's heard them and fully apologize for attempting to sell off our provincial parks out from under?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance and President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The illiteracy of the members across the aisle never ceases to amaze me. Mr. Speaker, in the budget it was very clear that additional revenues from this park pass would automatically be calibrated to the expenditures related to that park. Mr. Speaker, it's in the budget. It's very clear in the estimates.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
The Finance Minister will regret tying his legacy to the Premier and the Minister of the Environment on this matter. No humility from this government, and that's no surprise. We cannot have Alberta's parks users living in constant fear that the government will auction them off to the highest bidder, especially not after learning that the government cut deals with international coal billionaires to mine our mountains. Albertans don't trust this Premier. He's the least trusted Premier in all of Canada. I'm bringing a bill to the House later today that would enshrine legislative protections for Alberta parks. Will the government support it?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, talk about a lack of humility. He was part of a government that drove K-Country into the ground while visits increased, while the infrastructure deteriorated, while trash was being left behind, while conservation was being undermined. The NDP didn't invest a single incremental cent. We're turning that around. And then that member went out and led a completely false campaign suggesting that parks were being sold when he knows that was never true, it's not true, and it never will be true. Shame on him for trying to scare Albertans, Mr. Speaker.
The order. The honourable member for Calgary Klein is next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, our government announced our Open for Summer plan. It is a three-stage plan for our province to exit this pandemic and return to normal life. For many Albertans, indeed for all Albertans, it was the day that we have been waiting for. I know I'm excited to take my daughter Eden to her favorite restaurant. And we're in a good place. Our R value has fallen dramatically and active case numbers have dropped sharply. To the Minister of Finance, can you tell this House what reopening means for our economy?
Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Yesterday, indeed, was a day that we have been waiting for some time. What this means for our economy was, I think, best summed up by Ernie Tsu of the Alberta Hospitality Association, and I quote, "I'm ecstatic right now. I'm ecstatic to get my staff back to work. It's a good day. It's a good day to see our industry get back open," unquote. This means thousands of businesses will now be able to reopen their doors and thousands of Albertans will be back to work.
The honourable member for Calgary Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, it is a good day. Given our government has been in constant contact with businesses and communities throughout this pandemic, and given that we know that this dialogue with businesses has led to programs and changes to restrictions, as our government has adapted to ensure that safety is being preserved, but also that we're taking feedback from people who know their business the best. Can the Minister of Finance tell the House what businesses have asked for in this reopening plan?
Honourable the Minister of Finance, President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, to the member for the question, what businesses resoundingly told us is that they wanted certainty. They wanted a clear path out of restrictions. Like the Canadian Federation of Independent Business said yesterday, and I quote, "The reopening plan is a clear path forward to easing restrictions for small businesses. The plan provides hope and certainty to small businesses that have and will continue to face challenges in the months ahead."
For Calgary Klein.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for his work. Given we know that with this announcement of the Open for Summer plan, and some businesses will still need support until they can reopen and restrictions everywhere are lifted, such as the tourism industry. And given our tourism industry was hit first and the hardest by the pandemic, can the Minister of Finance tell this House what supports will remain in place for the tourism industry?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, it was announced that we're abating the tourism levy until the end of June. This means a total of $40 million in support for tourism businesses. Accommodation and food services, which includes many tourism businesses, is also a sector receiving the most important support, more support through the SME Relaunch Grant, which now has been extended to the end of June.
Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to frontline doctors in Calgary, the third wave of COVID saw record numbers of hospitalizations of people from areas like Northeast Calgary. Many of these essential frontline workers are from racialized communities, have no access to paid sick leave, and work in high-exposure environments. Yet they're far less likely to be vaccinated, and not from a lack of interest, but due to barriers accessing them. Now, last night, the Premier floated the idea of pop-up clinics at the Stampede as part of his reopening strategy, but mentioned nothing for these workers. To the Minister of Health, if there's enough vaccine for pop-up clinics at the Stampede, why have there been none for heavily impacted hotspots like Northeast Calgary?
The Honourable the Minister of Children's Services has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, over 2.57 million doses of vaccine have now been administered in Alberta. As of May 25th, over 58% of Albertans 12 and over have their first dose. We are also the leading province in the country in terms of the percentage of our population fully vaccinated. Mr. Speaker, we have also done things to address specific needs in specific communities. One great example is expanding the Genesis Clinic in Northeast Calgary, increasing capacity in those areas by 400%.
Honourable member for Edmonton City Centre.
Now, given, Mr. Speaker, that vaccine uptake is still low in those communities despite that, and given we've heard from primary care doctors who've been asking since February to plan and host pop-up clinics for these hard-hit communities and those who are vaccine hesitant, and that these doctors have made specific proposals to government based on their wildly successful clinics held at meatpacking plants but have gotten no response. And given that this is a clear and practical solution to save and protect lives and to lower case counts and hospitalizations to the Minister of Health, given lower hospitalizations and vaccinations are key components of the reopening schedule, shouldn't these badly needed pop-up clinics have been included in it?
The Honourable the Minister of Children's Services.
Mr. Speaker, that's an excellent question, and I'm happy to talk about Alberta's vaccine rollout because it is, in fact, the best in the country, with among the highest percentage of doses administered. As I've said, we're actively working to address areas where vaccine uptake is slower or lower than we'd like. This does include, like I said, expanding the Genesis Clinic in Northeast Calgary, increasing capacity by 400%. As the member opposite mentioned, temporary clinics at places like meatpacking plants, shelters, and work camps. Mr. Speaker, we're looking at setting up new temporary clinics in areas of need around the province, and we're happy about our record in terms of vaccine rollout.
The Honourable Member.
Given, Mr. Speaker, that they've had weeks, months to get these places in place, and given the jurisdictions across the globe are using targeted approaches to help frontline workers and all people access vaccines, move past their fears, given we've seen innovative strategies from governments across Canada, like overnight clinics, micro-targeted regional approaches, all designed to bring vaccines to where people are, given that migrant farm workers have been hard hit during this pandemic, don't have the resources and access to get vaccinated like other Albertans, to the Minister of Health, what is the plan for migrant farm workers? Will you work with the doctor's proposal to bring the pop-up clinics to them as part of the reopening plan?
The Honourable Member or Minister of Children's Services.
Mr. Speaker, you know, I am really proud of the work that health officials have done and our Minister of Health to target our vaccine rollout in a way that works for Albertans, and we are seeing very positive effects. Alberta has vaccinated 86% of those 80 plus, 83% of those between the ages of 70 and 79, 78% of those between the ages of 60 and 69, 68% of those aged 50 to 59. Mr. Speaker, we are taking a targeted approach. As I said in my last response, also announced this morning, Mr. Speaker, is a drive-through clinic in Northeast Calgary. We will continue to step up and meet the needs of Albertans.
Lethbridge West is next.
Last week, Standard & Poor's downgraded Alberta's credit rating yet again. This is the 6th downgrade for the UCP in just 2 years. In that 6th downgrade, S&P said Alberta's economy was the worst in Canada last year, will be among the worst in Canada this year, and our full recovery won't come even at the end of fiscal 23-24. So to the Minister, given that there has been no change to the failed No Jobs economic plan in response to these many and frequent failing grades from credit agencies, how many more credit downgrades can we expect?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance, President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to correct one item in the question, and that is the member opposite must have been thinking of the NDP downgrades because they had 6, we've only had 5. Mr. Speaker, the distinction is that, in fact, we faced a pandemic within our borders, the largest contraction in the global economy since the Great Depression, and the largest collapse in energy prices in modern history.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Well, you know, given that that rejoinder is not exactly what I think the minister thinks it is, and given that another downgrade said that, quote, the province has neither formally detailed the extent of its fiscal challenges nor provided details on a path toward recovery. Those are their words, Minister. So when the minister stands in this place and postures and blusters and plays politics, he is ignoring those credit agencies and thumbing his nose at their advice. So when will the UCP take responsibility and reverse this minister's failed No Jobs economic plan?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm quite intrigued by the member's opposite newfound interest in fiscal responsibility. Mr. Speaker, I share that interest, and I know Albertans broadly share that interest. And Mr. Speaker, that's why in Budget 2021, dealing with the economic fallout of the global pandemic and all of the economic challenges brought onto this province, we've included fiscal anchors that will inform our decisions, such as keeping our net debt to GDP ratio below 30% and delivering efficient government.
The Honourable Member.
Well, given, Mr. Speaker, that the credit agencies aren't buying that answer, and given we have the second highest unemployment rate in Canada, and given 50,000 jobs were lost before the pandemic and investment was fleeing the province, will the minister at least assure Albertans that he won't make our bad economic situation worse and add more risk and uncertainty for investors by pursuing terrible ideas like, oh, I don't know, pulling out of the CPP and gambling with our retirement?
Here, here. Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm pleasantly surprised and amazed at the members opposite newfound interest in fiscal responsibility. And Mr. Speaker, all we hear from them day after day after day is to spend more, spend more. Mr. Speaker, as we move forward with initiatives to deliver more efficient government, we will look forward to their support in the future.
The honourable member for Central, Peace Notley.
On May 21st, AHS issued a notice that the emergency department in Fairview would not have a doctor on site, quote, due to physician vacancies and an inability to secure locum coverage, end quote. This has happened multiple times in the past few months in McLennan too. I've had Albertans reach out from constituencies such as Rimbey, Rocky Mountain House and Sundre, and Tabor-Warner and others saying that they had the same problems in their rural communities. This is something people in urban centres would find unacceptable too. So to the minister, what is being done to solve the inability to secure temporary coverage for filling in doctor absences in rural Alberta?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to thank the member opposite for that question. Supply of physicians in smaller and rural communities is a long-standing challenge, not just in Alberta, but across Canada. In a smaller community, and I know this, Mr. Speaker, I grew up in very small communities, any change can result in temporary service changes. Coverage is especially difficult in the summer when physicians may be on holidays. We are, in fact, making progress, Mr. Speaker, including a net gain of physicians in the past year in spite of the extraordinary challenges of the pandemic. We know COVID-19 has certainly had an impact on this, and it makes it harder for AHS to provide locum coverage.
The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Given that there is no question that COVID has placed an additional burden on our health system, and this government has repeatedly declared a public health emergency, it simply is not acceptable to leave a sizable rural region with no emergency care. And presently, the Rural Health Professional Action Plan receives $8.7 million, has 24 employees, 12 board members, and has been operating for 30 years. And I'm sure they are doing some good work, but can you tell rural Albertans what the success of this organization has been in recruiting health professionals to rural Alberta?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I was saying, the challenge in finding locum coverage in rural areas is not necessarily new. It's part of the larger challenge that we have seen for decades in this province, but also across the country. It has been made more difficult because when we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we see physicians currently self-isolating. We see others unavailable due to having children in online schooling or because they do not feel comfortable traveling outside of their home community due to the risks around COVID-19. All of that reduces the pool of locums who can provide coverage, but we are hopeful that this will obviously be addressed as we
The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Given that I am proud to represent one of the largest and most diverse rural constituencies in Alberta that covers tens of thousands of square kilometres and is home to more than a dozen communities, multiple First Nations, 8 rural municipalities, and one of the largest French-speaking populations in Alberta, and all of these folks have a common need for doctors, not promises. And given that the plans should have dates with specific outcomes, because as the saying goes, a failure to plan is a plan for failure. Can the minister provide a timeline on when rural Alberta can expect to be served with appropriate numbers of health professionals so that these Albertans can receive the care they deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned, obviously some of this has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Yesterday's announcement and our declining case numbers will hopefully have a positive impact there. We'll continue to fund and improve initiatives that support rural Alberta, including the Rural Health Professions Action Plan. A special task force has also been formed to provide advice on issues surrounding the recruitment and retention, specifically for rural primary care physicians, which we know is an issue, Mr. Speaker, because we heard it from Albertans. Our government has also recently announced a $6 million investment over 3 years to help students pay for the costs of medical school, and we are confident that these will make a difference.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
According to their most recent quarterly report, Alberta's largest insurance provider, Intact, raked in a 380% increase in year-over-year profits. The UCP paved the way for these windfall profits after caving to lobbyists and removing the insurance rate cap. The pandemic has been going on for over a year, and Albertans are driving less but paying more. To the Minister of Finance, isn't it finally time to put a freeze on increases to premiums so Albertans stop getting hit with arbitrary increases? Better yet, why not reimburse some of the costs to drivers, as we've seen in many other provinces?
The Honourable Minister of Finance, President of the Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't surprise me anymore. The one piece of advice that we get time after time is to simply regulate revenues and profit from the members opposite. Mr. Speaker, I can't imagine a more regressive policy. What I can say is that Intact Insurance, Mr. Speaker, has in fact reduced automobile insurance rates by 3% in early 2021. Mr. Speaker, our reforms in Bill 41 are beginning to work. Mr. Speaker, insurance companies in Alberta have provided COVID relief for nearly a year, providing more than $182 million in refunds.
Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that drivers in Manitoba are getting an average of $160 back, in British Columbia it's $190, and given that in Saskatchewan, the Premier's good buddy Scott Moe is offering motorists up to $380 back in insurance premiums, what do we get here in Alberta? Rates increasing by up to 30%. So why won't the minister lift a finger when even Conservative premiers in Manitoba and Saskatchewan understand that drivers deserve a break on auto insurance during the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Honourable Minister of Finance, President of the Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the assertions in that question simply are not accurate. The reality is we brought in Bill 41, which brought in some necessary reforms that will lead, and in fact are beginning to lead, to lower automobile insurance premiums. And Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan and BC and other provinces are simply late to the game. Again, in Alberta, insurance companies have already offered motorists $182 million in refunds. That works out to $151 per automobile policy.
The Honourable Member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that no one is buying what this minister is offering, and given that HelloSafe reported that insurance companies stood to save $740 million due to COVID-19 restrictions taking cars off the road, and given there was a 28% drop in car accidents in 2020, and given that we know this Premier is in the pocket of insurance lobbyists, including his former Chief of Staff, and does whatever they ask, will the minister confirm he would rather cozy up to insurance companies than give a single dollar of the $750 million that they saved on the backs of Alberta drivers?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very clear from the line of questioning from the members opposite that they would want Alberta to go to a nationalized automobile insurance system, such as in BC. Well, Mr. Speaker, that has been the most disastrous automobile insurance system in the country. In fact, the Auditor General called it a dumpster fire. So, Mr. Speaker, we brought in some necessary reforms in Bill 41. Those reforms are starting to work. We've seen a 3% decrease in Intact's premiums for the current year and $182 in refunds from insurance companies to Alberta motorists.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford has a question.
Recently, I spoke with Victoria, a young woman who lives in Treaty 6. She told me about the stress she feels as a young Indigenous woman growing up in the shadow of the legacy of murdered and missing women. Victoria has shown a powerful commitment to her stolen sisters. While proud of what she is doing as an individual, she's disheartened that it's come down to this. June 3rd is just around the corner, and with it 2 years since the National Inquiry issued their final report and 231 calls for justice. We have seen little to no action from this government. Can the minister explain to Victoria why so little action has been taken?
The Honourable the Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. My colleague, the Minister of International Relations, has been working very hard on this particular file. Mr. Speaker, Indigenous women and girls are at a higher risk of violence, and this matters to our government. That's why we established the Alberta Joint Working Group on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. This group is part of our commitment, Mr. Speaker, to address the National Inquiry's calls to justice, ending all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, making Alberta a safer place for all. We continue to work on this file, and I know that my colleague, the Minister of Industrial Relations, this is a key item for him, and he will continue to work on this.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford.
More vagueness, no action. Given that Victoria wrote that families and survivors need support from government and police while they seek justice for themselves or their family, and given that call to justice number 1.3 calls for government to, quote, pursue prioritization and resourcing of measures required to eliminate the social, economic, cultural, and political marginalization of Indigenous women and girls, end quote, can the minister update this House on the status of call 1.3? And if he can't, can he explain to Victoria why this has not been a priority for the UCP?
The Honourable the Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, this definitely is a priority for our government and a priority for my colleague, the Minister of Indigenous Relations. Mr. Speaker, the Joint Working Group has been meeting regularly to fulfill their mandate. And recall, Mr. Speaker, that the mandate is to advise on how to address issues of violence and the calls for justice, to recommend how to work with Indigenous communities and governments and the private sector to build on ways to combat violence against Indigenous women and girls, and how to engage with family members and Indigenous organizations to get their advice. This group is continuing to do its work, and I know that my colleague will report on this in the near future.
The Honourable Member.
Minister, that's just all words. There's no action. Given that Victoria notes that more mental health, addictions, and housing supports are needed for Indigenous Albertans, and given that call to justice number 7.5 calls for, quote, necessary resources for specialized intervention, healing and treatment programs, and services and initiatives offered in Indigenous languages, end quote, which we have seen little action on since this government took office. Can the minister explain to Victoria, who is listening, Victoria, why hasn't this been a priority for the UCP government? What will it take for this government to actually act?
The Honourable the Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, this government is acting. We granted the Joint Working Group an extension to deliver the report of this year due to COVID-19 challenges. And Mr. Speaker, our government is taking action, real action. The Alberta, as an example, my colleague, Minister of Indigenous Relations, has traveled the province, met with Indigenous communities, and we're taking action so they can be involved better involved in the economy, for example, through the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. I am proud of the work our government is doing, and I'm proud of the work that my colleague is doing on this file.
The Honourable Member for West Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, the pandemic has had a devastating effect on many aspects of our lives. It has impacted our economy, our families, our physical and emotional health. This pandemic has inflicted unimaginable suffering on the lives of far too many. I have many constituents reaching out to share concerns of the impact of the mental health and well-being of them and their loved ones. To the Minister, in a time when mental wellness needs to be a key focus as we attempt to put our lives back together, what has and is our government doing to support the mental well-being of Albertans?
Well, the Minister of Children's Services has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for that really great question. Early on in the pandemic, the provincial government committed more than $53 million to mental health and addiction supports. When this was announced in April of 2020, it was, and I believe still is, the largest and most comprehensive support for mental health and addictions across the country. This included improving access to existing helplines and online resources such as the Addiction Helpline, the Mental Health Helpline, Kids Help Phone, Alberta 211, and Together All. I encourage the member to let his constituents know to visit alberta.ca/mental health for more information.
The Honourable Member for West Yellowhead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Minister. Given that our world hasn't experienced a global pandemic in over 100 years, and given we understand the short-term impacts of restrictions on mental health, and given that similar traumatic events have been shown to have both short and long-term consequences to mental well-being, to the Minister, how will the government recognize and address the underlying long-term effects to the mental health of Albertans as we move past COVID?
The Honourable the Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We absolutely know that the COVID-19 pandemic has been difficult. It's been tough on Albertans, Mr. Speaker, and once again, we were proud to invest the $53 million to increase access to addiction and mental health recovery supports that our province needed during and after as we move on from the COVID-19 pandemic. Of this funding, $25 million, Mr. Speaker, was allocated to support the COVID-19 Community Fund grant program. Some of this funding, Mr. Speaker, went to the members riding in West Yellowhead, including $80,000 for Hinton Adult Learning Society and $28,000 for Eagle Tower Victim Services.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Minister. Given that I have heard many concerns raised about the impacts to our youth throughout the pandemic, and given that many have seen their families struggle, witnessed the loss of playing sports, attending events, and had to alter their learning environment several times, and given that youth are still in the early developmental stages of their lives, parents, friends, and society are concerned about the long-term effects on Alberta's youth. So to the Minister, what will our government do to help youth that have been impacted by the pandemic as it relates to their mental health?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, along with my colleague from Calgary Southeast, we announced a youth mental health panel to study the effects the pandemic has had on kids and young people right across the province. We committed $21.4 million in April 2020 to improve the mental health helpline, the Kids Help Phone, online resources such as TogetherAll, Jack.org's Alberta COVID-19 Youth Mental Health Resource Hub, and Alberta 211. Also, Budget 2021 includes $34 million for children's health supports to expand addiction, mental health, and rehabilitation services for children and youth. Mr. Speaker, this is a very important question and important work.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods is next.
Mr. Speaker, Alberta essential workers have gone above and beyond during the pandemic. From our healthcare workers saving lives to the grocery store workers who've been feeding and supplying Alberta families. Every single worker deserves our thanks. This government, while claiming to respect these workers, took months to roll out the Critical Worker Benefit Program, and then many Albertans found out that they weren't eligible for it. Can the Minister of Labour update the House on this program? How many Albertans applied for the Critical Worker Benefit? How many applications were accepted, and how many were rejected?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Member mentioned, the Critical Worker Benefit was rolled out in February. This program was delivered through 5 different departments, including my own, which had a portal, and there's also a portal through Health, had their own portal. It closed at the end of April, and I can report back to the House that we're still finalizing some of the last of the applications. I can give the numbers associated with my department, that the payments that have been done, but we're still continuing to process the applications, and I'll get to the numbers in my next answer.
The Honourable Member, order. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Millwoods.
Given that the UCP was given this federal money during the first wave to support workers, but it took them months to use it, which, to be clear, shows a level of respect that the UCP has for working people, and given that workers performing essential work, like those driving taxis, working retail, and some healthcare workers, were completely excluded from this benefit, given I've heard heartbreaking tales from workers and employers who found out too late that they didn't qualify, and now I'm hearing from workers who are still waiting for their payment, to the Minister, how many workers are still waiting to receive the money from this benefit?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, or for the Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government focused on identifying workers who provided critical services during the second wave. I can tell you that through my department, 4,500 employers have received and distributed the Critical Worker Benefit. More than 98,400 workers have been approved to receive the Critical Worker Benefit, and more than $121 million in funding has been approved for payment or already distributed. Mr. Speaker, as previously indicated, the portal closed at the end of April. We allowed time for additional information to be provided, and those funds are still being distributed, and we can give the final numbers to the Honourable Member
for
at a later
Millwoods.
Given that this UCP government has failed in every instance to stand up for Alberta workers by refusing to introduce paid sick leave, stalling on the wage top-ups, rolling back workers' rights during a pandemic, and firing tens of thousands of education workers, and given that the essential workers denied this benefit deserve to know why the Minister of Labour did not consider their work to be critical, will the Minister table in this House the justification for excluding hardworking Albertans, as well as the reasons Albertans were rejected, as well as the number of Albertans rejected, and the number of Albertans who are still waiting for their money?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I reject the majority of the comments made by the Honourable Member. That's simply not true. Our government is focused on supporting workers through this pandemic. We delivered the Critical Worker Benefit. Mr. Speaker, as you know, this benefit included social service workers, healthcare workers, education workers, and critical private sector workers, such as those in grocery cashiers, pharmacy assistants, and gas station attendants. Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to deliver this program. It's not finalized. I'm pleased to actually provide the numbers to the Honourable Member once the program is finalized.
Honourable Member for St. Albert.
January 27, 2020, the UCP gave 1 month notice to disabled Albertans that age payment dates would change, meaning they'd have to extend their income for almost another week. This was March of 2020, the month the global pandemic was declared. The UCP did this to book $152 million into the next fiscal year to make their books look better. The Auditor General made them correct this because this was not in accordance with public sector accounting standards. Minister, prior to announcing this policy change that would impact 70,000 disabled Albertans and their families, who outside of government was consulted to evaluate and mitigate the risk?
The Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to say for the record, the Minister of Community and Social Services has consulted with everyone, and the member knows that. These things were done in order to align services for all of the folks within all of the sectors. I've never actually seen a minister who's been as engaged as our Minister of Community and Social Services. And I'm very, very happy to stand here on her behalf, especially because so much of our work between our ministries collaborate, and the work that she's done and the consultations that she has done have been far and wide.
The Honourable Member, order, the Honourable Member for St. Albert.
None of that was correct. Yeah. Given the AG stated, community and social services process requires that when proposing significant program changes, management prepare a thorough analysis considering the impact and implications of the proposed changes, including various options for making change and any consultations conducted. Given the structural payment date changes impacted approximately 130,000 Albertans, Minister, which organizations or individuals outside of the ministry were consulted in order to assess the risk of forcing people already living in poverty to stretch their tiny...
The Honourable the Minister of Status of Women.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to clarify again for this member that the aligning of the payments for the first month provides a consistency for schedules for Albertans. It doesn't change the amount of the benefits, which the member keeps continuing to try and misrepresent the actual dollars that were put in this program, which actually creates more fear for the very people that she believes that she's representing. On top of that, as we proceed with Alberta's recovery plan, we will find new and appropriate ways to make sure that the services are delivered.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
The Minister of Finance claimed the decision was to move Asian income support payments was based on the advice of the AG. We know this is incorrect. And given the government's credibility is at an all-time low with the disability community following 2 years of cuts to core benefits, exploding wait lists, demeaning spin, like you saw, ongoing failures to consult this community, is this the minister's position that she was advised by the AG to change the dates, or will she finally admit and apologize that this change was not made in the best interest of Albertans?
The Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
I'll try answering it again, Mr. Speaker. The alignment was done to more closely bring payments together. The idea that is coming from this member that there's some nefarious scheme in order to take advantage of our vulnerable people in this province, that is what's demeaning, especially for the folks and families who rely on these dollars. What the NDP is doing is absolutely promoting fear, and especially at a time of COVID, especially when our vulnerable people are suffering, this kind of behavior is exactly the reason why the people of this province do not trust the NDP.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Highwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After years of economic stagnation, Alberta has experienced a pandemic, the worst global economic downturn in nearly a century, a commodity crash, and this has resulted in a significant number of Albertans being underemployed or completely unemployed. On May 19th, the Minister of Labour and Immigration introduced Alberta Jobs Now, the largest job program in the history of our province. To the Minister of Labour and Immigration, can you explain how this program will work to create jobs for Albertans?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much to the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the Alberta government is investing $370 million to help employers hire unemployed Albertans. The Alberta Jobs Now program helps employers offset the costs of creating jobs and training new employees while giving unemployed or underemployed Albertans an opportunity to find a job or receiving training that improves their skills. Small, medium, and large businesses in the private and nonprofit sectors can apply to receive a grant that they can use to train employees or subsidize their wages or both. And employers can apply at alberta.ca /jobs-now. The program is now open, Mr. Speaker. This is the first intake, and we're looking forward to many more.
The honourable member for Highwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that answer. Given that we have now heard how the Alberta Jobs Program will help Albertans get back to work, and given that COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in significant challenges and major losses to many Alberta-based businesses, including many in my own constituency of Highwood, to the same minister, how will this program support Alberta's economic recovery and strengthen our economic future?
The Honourable the Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, bold actions are needed to help struggling businesses get unemployed Albertans back to work. The Alberta Jobs Now program is a key part of Alberta's broader economic recovery plan. Reducing costs for employers through funding encourages them to hire and train Albertans, and it gets unemployed Albertans back to work. Employers will get a grant that covers up to 25% of the employee's salary for a 52-week period to a maximum of $25,000 per employee. An employer can use the funding for up to 20 new employees per intake, and we expect the program to support hiring over 20,000 Albertans.
The honourable member for Highwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and once again, thank you to the Minister for that answer. And given that every Albertan deserves the opportunity to fully participate in the workforce, and given that Albertans with disabilities are often limited from doing so, to the Minister of Community and Social Services, how will the Alberta Jobs Now program reduce barriers for those Albertans living with disabilities so they can fully participate in the workforce?
Honourable the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women has risen.
Yes, and thank you again so much to our Minister of Labour and Immigration. Mr. Speaker, folks that are living with disabilities make essential contributions to Alberta's economy every day, but the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is much higher than the average Albertan. That's not because of lack of ability, Mr. Speaker. It often comes with a lack of opportunity. Under the Jobs Now, employers who hire persons with disabilities will receive a grant 1.5 times higher than the amount that they receive with other new employers. Mr. Speaker, every Albertan deserves to have meaningful employment to earn a living and be included as a valuable member of their community.
Honourable members, that concludes the time allotted for oral question period. Given the royal assent ceremony that will take place in just a few minutes, we're going to proceed immediately to the remainder of the routine. If members have other commitments, I ask them to leave the chamber quickly, quietly, and expeditiously.
Reports by standing and special committees. Presenting
the honourable member for Edmonton Goldbar.
Speaker, I rise to table a petition that contains the signatures of 3,079 Albertans from all over the province that calls for the government to prohibit any new open-pit coal mining in Alberta and to reinstate the 1976 coal development policy.
introduction of bills.
Member for Peace River.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very proud to rise today to request leave to introduce a bill being the Polish-Canadian Heritage Day Act. And I think all members of this Assembly will agree that Polish Canadians, particularly in Alberta, which is the second largest Polish community in the country, are incredibly important to our society today, our heritage and the fabric of who we are as a community of Albertans. So I will ask, as the day soon approaches, the Polish community and I work together on this for the second Sunday in June, being the annual day were this act to pass, for unanimous support in this House and a non-partisan approach to what I think is an important recognition of important people in Alberta. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Peace River has moved first reading of Bill 217, Polish-Canadian Heritage Day Act. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for first reading? If so, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 217, Polish-Canadian Heritage Day Act is now read a first time.
The honourable member for Edmonton Goldbar.
Mr. Speaker, I rise and request leave to introduce Bill 218, the Provincial Parks Protecting Parks Boundaries Amendment Act 2021. The Act responds to the thousands of Albertans that over the last year have been actively campaigning to protect our parks and asked us to implement stronger protections for our parks and recreation areas. The bill would enshrine in law that if the government were to ever reduce the size of a park or recreation area, or wanting to declassify a provincial park, the government would be required to post the plan changes publicly, consult publicly with Albertans, and bring these changes to the legislature for a vote. Parks are our natural heritage and are deeply valued by Albertans. Many Albertans share fond memories of vacations spent and would like to see them protected. And as such, I move first reading of Bill 218.
The Honourable Member of Edmonton for Edmonton Gold Bar has moved first reading of Bill 218, Provincial Parks, Protecting Park Boundaries Amendment Act 2021. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for first reading? If so, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. My opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 218, Provincial Parks Protecting Park Boundaries Amendment Act 2021 is now read a first time. Tabling returns.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West. Just after
Rise
Royalist.
to table the requisite number of copies from Standard & Poor's Global Rating Agency, who have just lowered Alberta's long-term rating. Once again, this is the sixth credit downgrade because one of the ratings houses downgraded the province 2 notches during the UCP's tenure for a total of 6, Mr. Speaker.
Are there others? Seeing none.
Tablings to the clerk, deferred divisions.
Honourable members, we will now proceed to royal assent. At this time, if you can ensure all electronic devices are put away, we will prepare the chamber for Her Honour's presence. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, Her Honour, the Honourable the Lieutenant Governor will now attend upon the Assembly.
Sergeant at Arms, admit Her Honor, the Honorable the Lieutenant Governor.
Please be seated.
May it please your honor, the Legislative Assembly has, at its present sitting, passed a certain bill to which, and in the name of the Legislative Assembly, I respectfully request your honor's assent.
Your Honor, the following is the title of the bill to which your honor's assent is prayed. Bill 64, Public Lands Amendment Act 2021. This is the bill to which your honor's assent is prayed. In Her Majesty's name, Her Honor, the Honorable the Lieutenant Governor, doth assent to this bill.
All right, please.
Please be seated. Orders of the day. Orders du jour.
Committee of the Whole.
Thank you, honorable members. I would like to call the Committee of the Whole to order. The committee has before it today Bill 56, Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021. Are there any questions, comments, or amendments to be made at this time? Seeing none. I am prepared to ask the question. Are you ready for the question on Bill 56, Local Measures Statutes Amendment Act 2021? On the clauses of the bill, are you agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried. On the title and preamble, are you agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. Carried. Okay. A1. The committee now has before it Bill 57, Métis Settlements Amendment Act 2021. Are there any questions or comments to be made at this time? We are currently on Amendment A1. I see the honourable member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an honor to rise, as always, in this chamber. Today we have before us Bill 57, and to be quite frank, I've not had an opportunity to speak to this bill at length, and we have before us an amendment from this government, and which is actually quite interesting because we haven't seen a lot of government amendments. Now, I just want to quickly remind folks, all those people watching at home, what this amendment essentially does. It strikes out 3 councillors and substitutes the number of councillors that constitutes a quorum. Well, I'm sure the viewers at home are not necessarily needing to know the exact specifics of this bill, but I can tell you, in a nutshell, and after consulting with our Indigenous relations critic, the member from Edmonton Rutherford, can tell you we absolutely oppose this government amendment. And to explain a little bit more as to why we oppose it, I would just like to refresh folks' memories about this bill generally. One of the biggest concerns that we have with Bill 57 is the lack of consultation. We've heard, I can talk to you about Herb Blair, fantastic fellow who I've met multiple times, president of the Métis Settlement General Council. He came and he stood with us and he said he was not consulted. The changes in Bill 57 appear to be imposed unilaterally on the Métis settlements. And what's shocking about this, what's most shocking about this, is this is a government that continues to claim in this chamber that they consult with Albertans. And it's another example where they are absolutely misrepresenting that fact. Absolutely, I can point to countless examples, pieces of legislation where this government has failed to consult. We could talk about parks. We could talk about AISH. We could talk about countless education bills. We could talk about countless healthcare bills where healthcare workers weren't consulted. The list goes on. I don't want to talk at length here because I know my colleagues have a lot to say on this bill as well. But the point is, this is a government that continues to fail to consult with Albertans. And in this case, they absolutely failed to consult with the Métis community. And we know that the Métis Settlement Council has been exceptionally clear that without consultations, without further consultations, this bill cannot go forward. So what do we have before us? We have this government's attempt at trying to make a bad bill just a little bit better. Yet sadly, they're failing. Because what this amendment will do shows exactly what Métis folks have been telling us, that that this government is not listening. It's going to limit the voice of Métis peoples. Why is it that this government feels that they can speak for Métis folks? Why is it that they feel that they can move forward with substantive legislation without consultation? I wasn't part of this, part of the NDP government from 2015 to 2019, but I sure do remember those government members harping on the NDP for not consulting enough. You're doing exactly what you accused us of. What did Herb Blair say? He said, we're opposed to this for the simple reason that we have a due diligence to our constituents. And I would argue that this government has a due diligence to its constituents as well. Of course, we're talking about the Métis settlements, and not all of us in this legislature have Métis settlements in our ridings, but you absolutely have folks who identify as Métis. You absolutely have folks who identify as part of the Indigenous community. And so why aren't you listening? It's a simple question. And I hope perhaps somebody in this chamber from the government side will stand up today and explain the intent behind this amendment, because we've heard from community members that this is not what they want. They don't want to be dictated by this government. This government's talked multiple times about collaboration and moving forward together. This is exactly what you're not doing with Bill 57 and with this amendment specifically. And so we are going to absolutely vote against this amendment. But we're also, and I mean, we've presented multiple concerns about this bill. We've urged this government to listen, to take a step back, to listen to the Métis settlements, and to set this bill aside, to start again. I'm fearful. I mean, I don't want to, presuppose the findings of this assembly, but we have similar concerns. I'll give a parallel example, not a perfectly parallel example, but the example of curriculum right now. How many stakeholders need to tell this government that this curriculum is wrong before they listen? This Premier talks about widespread support. Widespread support amongst his caucus? That's not widespread support amongst Albertans. And we can point to countless organizations, Indigenous serving organizations as an example, who have fundamentally rejected this curriculum. Whether you're talking about the Treaty 6 Confederacy, whether you're talking about the Métis Nation of Alberta, whether you're talking about countless elders, including the fantastic elder Betty Latondre, who happens to be a constituent of Edmonton Highlands Norwood and happens to be an incredible woman and voice for the community. Wilton Littlechild, what did he say? Oh, well, I haven't even seen the most recent drafts, right? The one person that this government continued to tokenize as a supporter of this curriculum. So I present that example, again, just as a caution to this government, as a caution for you to stop, for you to listen, for you to consult, and for you to stop moving forward with Bill 57. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my chair. Philip?
Thank you, Honourable Member. And just for clarity, Amendment A1 has been dealt with by this committee already. So we are on the main bill, Bill 57, Métis Settlements Amendment Act 2021. I don't think it affects anything that was stated in your recent comments. Are there any members wishing to join debate on Bill 57? Seeing none, I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton South has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to rise and speak on the bill today. I think that it's very important that when we talk about these issues and we talk about consultation and we talk about meaningful engagement, that it is something we actually understand cannot be done unilaterally and without engagement and it's something that this government seems to not understand over and over and over again, right? It's something that this government seems to not be able to figure out over and over and over again, is that they said they had 19 meetings with Métis General Council, and Mr. Chair, while that may be true, it seems as though that every single stakeholder when spoken to about this bill continues to think that the consultations were inadequate, right? That the consultations were insufficient and that this government did an insufficient job of actually engaging on this bill. So it's something that's very strange, it's something that's very disappointing, and it's something that we see this, the Métis Settlement General Council themselves have said that they're opposed to this legislation, right? The due diligence of this government, and I'm going to quote from the president of the Métis Settlement General Council here, the president, Herb Blair, quote, "We're opposed to this for the simple reason that we have a due diligence to our constituents," end quote. So, Mr. Chair, it's very clear that the minister did not meet the standard of consultation. It's very clear that the minister did not actually engage meaningfully. It's very clear that the Métis people and communities do not support this legislation. So why does this government insist on moving forward, right? Why does this government insist on ramming through these significant changes, insist on ramming through these extraordinary changes without having done the proper work? And Mr. Chair, I think it's something that we can look at in a broader context and say, yes, we actually do understand what this government is going for. And what this government is going for is that they don't appear to care about that consultation, right? For a government which signed so many grassroots guarantees, large signs during the campaign where the Premier himself would put his name on the line and say, "I guarantee we will listen to the people." That's what the Premier was purporting during the campaign. For a Premier who did that, it seems as though instead of having done any of the things he swore he would do in those signatures, instead has decided he's going to ram through his agenda and spend his time focusing on his own leadership, right? It's something that's so profoundly disappointing for this government. It's so profoundly disappointing for this government because it simply shows they do not understand the issues that matter to Albertans. They do not understand the issues that matter to the public here, Mr. Speaker. And it's something that's very upsetting, right? It's very upsetting because we know that this act, we know that this bill is going to treat Métis settlements more like municipalities, and it's going to, it may degrade the protection of the constitutional rights of Métis people in this country. And it's something that does not allow us to properly future-proof our Métis communities against these types of attacks. And Mr. Chair, this government simply wouldn't even consult properly on that process, right? They wouldn't even consult properly on that process. So the changes that are being suggested are very disruptive. The changes that are being suggested are very disappointing. The changes that are being brought forward in this bill are a pattern of behavior from this government, right? A government which, instead of doing the work that Albertans expected us to do, instead of coming here and debating bills like this, honestly, right now one of the things that we're doing is very important for the democratic process. It's the opposition holding the government to account, right? That's a fundamental part of our democracy in our Westminster parliamentary system here in Canada and Alberta. And what the government did, instead of debating this bill as well as many others, such as paid sick leave for Albertans during a global pandemic, is they ran and they hid for 3 weeks, right? In the middle of a crisis, the government ran away and hid. But you know what they had time for, Mr. Chair? You know what the government had time for? The government had time to spend a full day talking about the leadership of this Premier and whether he should remain Premier, right? Those are the types of priorities we're seeing from this government. It's something that's profoundly disappointing. It's something that's very strange, and it's very strange because they could have spent those 3 weeks, perhaps, instead of taking a COVID vacation, instead of deciding to run away and talk about the Premier's leadership and decide how their caucus should be run. Instead of looking internally, perhaps the government should have taken that 3 weeks and actually gone out and consulted with Métis people, and actually consulted with the Métis councils and Métis settlements. And perhaps the government could have taken that time and done the real work that was expected of them, that is required of them. And instead, Mr. Chair, what we see is we come back after the government ran away and hid for 3 weeks, after the government did nothing other than look internally and look at whether the Premier has the support of his own caucus members for 3 weeks, after we saw that profoundly shocking display of arrogance by the Premier. What we see now is we come back to a bill where no additional work has been done. We're in committee of the whole. We have the opportunity to make substantive changes, to change and bring forward positive changes that would have addressed many of the concerns that have been raised by myself and my colleagues in this place over the last many weeks here, Mr. Chair. And instead of doing any of that, instead, what we see is the government took 3 weeks to take their COVID vacation, to run and hide from the spotlight, to run and hide when Albertans were sick across this province in the middle of the global pandemic. And Mr. Chair, none of the work that would have addressed the concerns brought forward by Métis settlements, the concerns brought forward by the Métis settlement councils were dealt with in any meaningful way, right? The government keeps pointing to these consultations they did. The Métis Settlement General Council doesn't consider them adequate consultation. We know that again and again. So Mr. Chair, it is simply put that this government doesn't seem to know what they're doing, right? They seem to be fumbling around. They seem to be fumbling around, trying to hold on to. Well, the Premier appears to be fumbling around, trying to hold on to his caucus, trying to hold on to control, instead of spending the time required to develop meaningful policy. Right? Instead of spending the time required to go out and say, how can we make life better for Albertans? How can we make life better for people living on Métis settlements? Instead of trying to do any of that work, the government is, and this Premier in particular, is spending the majority of his time struggling with control of his own caucus. And I think that's something that Albertans deserve better than, frankly. I think, frankly, Albertans deserve a government which is laser focused on making sure that our economy, our communities are safe, is growing and has and is meaningful. But instead, what we see is a government that's focused almost entirely on itself, right? We're going to spend an entire day on a caucus meeting. I think it's an over 7-hour caucus meeting in one day, where they simply debated whether the Premier should continue to be the Premier, right? That's the type of priority this government is taking forward, instead of focusing on the work that we're doing here in the legislature, instead of doing the work Albertans elected us and sent us here to do. This government's priorities are on the Premier instead of on Albertans. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and Status of Women has risen to join debate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wow, I'm not quite sure where to start. Let's start with laser focused. The opposition is laser focused on division and fear. And I would like to say thank you to our Minister of Indigenous Relations for the consultations that he did for over a year on this. I'd also like to, I'd asked a question to the members across the way when I last debated this regarding the hundreds of millions of dollars that went missing from the funds that actually belong to the Métis settlements. Because for those of folks who are listening today, government is actually in control of the distribution of those funds to the Métis settlements. Did you know that they don't have control over that? Which is actually what this bill does. It gives them actual control over their dollars, their ability to do their elections, to be able to run independently, to be significantly involved with their own people, which I would think for folks who care about what the Métis settlements want, they're going to want to make sure that there's an accountability and a sustainability there for the people. The Métis settlements in this province are spectacularly special and unique to the country. And the hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone missing from those funds, up until now, the NDP can actually take credit for the actual dissemination of those funds within the Métis settlements, because they just gave out dollars willy-nilly, not realizing that those dollars weren't actually making it to the people in those very settlements. This bill adds accountability to the folks that live in these settlements, to whom the dollars belong to actually, not to the government of Alberta, and certainly not to the minister, who's taken upon himself to remove himself from that distribution and give it back to the Métis settlements so they are actually independent and are able to function and be able to do what people should do when they're governing for themselves. Isn't that what we're all here about, is pieces of reconciliation and independence and autonomy? The NDP is fighting against Métis autonomy. Is it a perfect solution? I'm sure tweaks and things will need to happen, but guess what? That will be decisions that happen between the Métis settlements and the government, whoever happens to be in the government. In fact, the member, the last time that we had this debate, stood up and said, and I asked her, I said, so how do the Métis settlements feel about the fact that all of those hundreds of millions of dollars had disappeared from the fund? It should be over $120 million in that fund right now. I think it's under 30. Maybe even 18, I can't remember exactly, so please forgive me if I'm not quoting that exactly. You know what she said? Well, they haven't sued us. Well, it's a good thing, because if you're still in government, chances are that could have happened, especially if they had the availability to do that, being able to self-govern at this point. The entire point of this is for them to be able to collect taxes for water and roads and everything, all of the things the rest of us take for granted that governments do on the behalf of on behalf of the taxpayers. Why shouldn't the Métis settlements have that opportunity? Why shouldn't they be able to do that with their money? Instead of asking government for permission to have dollars to go to their settlements, to be able to use in their settlements on their behalf because government said they could. It kind of seems counterintuitive compared to what the NDP would lead you to believe that this legislation is actually about. And you know, the other thing is too, is when dollars are coming into any organization, I mean, the NDP has stood in here for the last 14 months demanding transparency, just like we did. When we were in opposition, over dollars spent, all that's completely fair, it's their job. Well, don't the Métis people in Métis settlements also have the right to demand transparency from their leaders as to where their dollars are going and how they're being spent? I would think so. I would think so. Their elections are coming up here soon. Their elections, just like the rest of us have, they're responsible to the people to whom elect them. And so I just, when you think about good governance and planning and what it takes to be able to make sure that these incredible and beautiful and spectacularly special and unique settlements can be as prosperous as possible, to be able to facilitate on behalf of their people, independent of government and how it is that we would like to distribute their dollars. But that's the problem, is that if you look at the opposition, they think they know better. Of course they're going to tell the Métis people how to spend their money and who it should go to. That's the most hysterical part about this argument. One thing to debate, it's another thing, and then to have one of the MLAs stand up and criticize how our premier looks, or his pockets, or where he puts his hands, or where are we? Are we is this elementary school? And in fact, I wouldn't even say that, because most elementary kids I know are kinder and more loving to each other than that I just heard here, where they criticize a man for what he looks like, how he puts his hands in his pockets, what he's wearing. It's all in Hansard. You can go read it. It was just said. So honestly, I'm not quite sure what that has to do with this piece of legislation or the committee of the whole that we're in. I'm curious about what they'll say about my outfit next. It's interesting. If that's part of the decision-making process about why we trust or we don't trust, very interesting. And I'm certainly glad it was said in here because it's on Hansard. It's okay for the NDP to sit here and character assassinate and talk about what a person looks like or what they're wearing in order to determine whether or not a piece of legislation is good or not. Interesting. Very, very interesting. I'm really glad that the people of Alberta are able to hear that. Truly impressive, I have to say. You know, when you're modernizing legislation, it's difficult. It's tricky. It's not going to be easy. There's going to be, quirks and things that need to be fixed. But, I have complete faith in the Métis settlements and the folks that run the Métis settlements to be able to work independently and involved with government in order to fix, change, or do whatever it is they need to do over the next little while. And quite frankly, the Métis settlements have every right to have difference of opinion of how things look. The truth is that they haven't been able to use the money they wanted to or collect taxes in the manner that they wanted to before now. Of course there's going to be differences of opinion. That's normal. It doesn't mean that it's all wrong or that again, I use this word again, something nefarious behind it. And our Minister of Indigenous Relations did do those consultations. It wasn't just 19. Spent a year consulting with the various Métis nations across, or with the various Métis organizations across the province. This is all about hardworking, strong, beautiful human beings who deserve the opportunity to have the conversations, who are passionate about preserving their way of life. And, when you realize that the sustainability of those Métis settlements are dependent around how those dollars are spent, I would assume that the NDP, like us, would prefer that the Métis settlements had control over those dollars. I'm quite certain they're going to know how to spend their money better than we do. I'm absolutely positively certain about that. And I can't wait to, once we are through the dark side of COVID, to be able to go out and visit with all of these folks and to chat with them and to have conversations in their spaces, on their terms, talk about how things are going, to get really, really entrenched back into the culture and spend time. These are truly amazing individuals. You know, when you have the privilege of being in here, you learn a lot. And one of those things is a tremendous amount of humility. And when you're going out and you're doing these consultations, it's always led with humility. And if anybody knows our Indigenous Relations Minister, humility is at the top of the list of who this person is. And like I said, is it going to be perfect? No. I would imagine that any piece of legislation that comes, there's going to be people for and against that piece of legislation. That is a difficult part of governing. It's a difficult part of coming up with legislation. For anybody who was in government before, they know that, right? So I'm not suggesting that it's perfect. That would be nice, but we all know that that's not even possible. But having said that, the idea that the kinds of things that have been said that have absolutely nothing to do with this legislation, that are being twisted and manipulated in order to, I'm not quite sure what point they're trying to prove, but you know, I have to say that the transparency and the requirement to publish annual reports in plain language in financial disclosures, I know that when we were in opposition, that's what the Métis settlements were asking the NDP to do. I also know, I'm trying to think of the other thing, because I remember when we were talking to them, I know that they wanted to have government removed from the future fund. I know that for a fact. I know that because we talked to the people in the settlements. It's frustrating for anybody to not know where their dollars are going, right? But yet, the NDP had 4 years, Mr. Chair, to actually make that change. If there was a better way of doing it, why didn't they do it, Mr. Chair? Why? And it's interesting that these were actually things that were asked for by the Métis people. So again, I'm not suggesting that it's perfect or that there's not tweaks or things that need to be made, and I'm quite certain that our Minister of Indigenous Relations will be having many, many, many conversations to be able to look at this and see what needs to happen. But I can tell you one thing for sure that's not going to happen. We're not going to spend $100 million of their money because we have access to it and we just decide that, you know, that's our role and we're going to tell them how to spend their money. That's not going to happen with this government. The NDP, though, you can honestly look at them and ask them, where did $110 million go? How was it spent? Who did it go to? How was it distributed? I would highly recommend those folks who are reaching out about this ask the NDP when they were in government where that money went. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. I see the Honourable Member for Lethbridge West has risen to join debate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to provide my reflections on the main part of this bill. I believe I've only spoken to an amendment so far. And indeed, I will... No, I know. Amendment.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Sorry.
I thought that you
Sorry.
mentioned that we were on the amendment. So,
yeah.
Sometimes the mask blurs it up. So please continue. Yes.
Thank you to the Honourable Member opposite for her interventions. Anyway, we are here because essentially, you know, I think it's fair to say that if the Métis Settlements General Council and the President had expressed support for this piece of legislation, then we would all be on our merry way and we would pass it and everyone would be very happy. But as it turns out, not everyone is happy. And so here we are. Certainly we have some on the record comments from leadership at the MSGC indicating that they will be seeking an injunction on this particular piece of legislation. And one of the pieces that the Indigenous leadership at the MSGC kept, one of the phrases that kept surfacing in his public comments and his interventions was the honor of the Crown. And the honor of the Crown is a specific promise intended to create an obligation of the Crown. It is when the Crown exercises its authority in more of a discretionary way. It is not the usual understanding of fiduciary responsibility, though it can take up fiduciary responsibility. Now, of course, this area of law has been a different kind of journey than what we see on the First Nations side, because For some, it is a land-based conversation, but for most of Canada's Métis, it's a rights-based conversation. Now, but in the case of the MSGC, we have a land-based conversation because indeed, the honour of the Crown has been exercised and demonstrated over and over again since 1895 in Alberta. In 1885, the Northwest Rebellion resulted in many Métis people coming to north and central East Alberta with a land base identified by the provincial government at St. Paul in 1895. In 1931, the Métis made a formal petition to this provincial legislature for land and a few other services like healthcare. And in 1935, this House set aside those lands. In 1938, the Métis Betterment Act was passed through the very chamber that we are standing in. And in fact, historians have observed that that Métis Betterment Act evinced a unique cooperation between the Crown and Métis people in the development of the Act and its attendant regulations. Now, time marches on, 1968 to 1988. There's a long, protracted process of litigation around oil and gas revenues, which in fact resulted in this future fund that the honourable member across the way is referring to. So in 1988, another bill passes this chamber, the Métis Settlement Act, which gives the minister broad powers. But again, those broad powers, as they're enumerated in the regulation, are exercised in conjunction with the MSGC. So what we have here is a framework for governance on a specific land base based on a more than a century specific promise to Métis people in the settlements, quote, intended to create obligation of the Crown. We have the honour of the Crown, that piece that has been triggered by these by Alberta's historic approach to the Métis settlements. Now, so that, that is a very interesting development. And the fact of the matter is that it then requires certain levels of consultation and ways of making changes for how these areas are governed. Why? Because Métis people are not just living in some, any old municipality, Mr. Chair, which is what this bill essentially is designed to do. It's designed to allow the Crown to run away from those specific promises, treat Métis people who've been living on that land base and were promised that land base by this legislature more than a century ago. What it allows it to do is just say, is to sort of wash their hands of the inherent requirements, constitutional requirements, based on an approach that essentially denies the indigeneity of folks who are living on or affected by Métis settlements. So that's why the leadership has indicated that they are going to be pursuing an injunction. Now, I don't believe that we should, in this House, do things that we just know are going to result in just making a whole bunch of money for lawyers. I just don't think it's in the public interest at all. If, in fact, there is merit to what the member across the way was just talking about, in terms of the restructuring of the future fund, and there were some other things in there that were said. If, in fact, there is some public policy merit to that, B, if there is some response to changing conditions from how things have changed to Métis settlements since the 1988 Métis Settlement Act, then it appears from what has happened over time here that process needs to be in conjunction with the MSGC, because that is how it has proceeded for many, many years. Indeed, since the 1938 passage of the Métis Betterment Act in this House. And so this idea that, they're just going to be municipalities like any other, that they're going to, as the minister across the way talked about, it's about, water system and roads, and, they have to be able to, charge taxes like anyone else. That is erasing the history of Métis identity in these areas, and the courts will, I think, look askance at it. So I don't, for that reason, it is not in the public interest to barrel head with this piece of legislation. And in fact, the government has not responded to any of those questions. If they had responses to them, if they had the MSG saying, yep, this is actually the way we need to proceed, or, you know, we're going to work on this piece in regulation with you, or whatever the case may be, then we would be happy to support this piece of legislation. But as it stands, this is extremely problematic, and I believe reflects a need for an attitude adjustment on the part of the Crown. Because you can't just go around saying you're Indigenous and you're not by act of provincial legislature. The Constitution doesn't work that way. And that is why this piece of legislation needs more deliberation and ultimately at this committee stage more answers that are, you know, actually factual and not just impudence masquerading as, you know, debate, but actual answers as to how these questions will be grappled with. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any other members looking to join debate? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Decore has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to rise here this afternoon to provide some brief comments here, because I know some of my other colleagues are very anxious to also add their comments this afternoon to Bill 57 as well. You know, I listened intently to the Minister of Culture characterizing the opposition's stance on this and how we weren't talking about the bill. Okay, so let's talk about the bill then, Mr. Chair. Here we have changes to the Métis Settlement Act that clearly are not being accepted by the number one stakeholder for the government. I'll say that again, just in case I wasn't quite clear. The number one stakeholder, the Métis Settlement General Council. And their president, Herb Blair, said, we're opposed to this for the simple reason that we have a due diligence to our constituents. And so there's been significant concern that the bill itself, Bill 57, the legislation that's being proposed, does not deliver on some amendments the Council has voted on and asked for, but implements others that they did not ask for and did not want. And so you can talk about how all the meetings that you've had, your number one stakeholder is saying you dropped the ball. And not only did you drop the ball, I think you then kicked it down the street as well. And you should have taken the time to look at this. And, you know, I thought it was rather ironic, Mr. Chair. You know, the Minister of Culture was saying, you know, looking forward to having discussions once we get out of the dark side of COVID. Maybe you should have had those discussions before you even tabled this legislation. I was also rather interested, and I never got the opportunity earlier in debate to touch on this. But one of the things the Minister of Indigenous Relations had touched on was this bill was about, characterized parts of it as red tape reduction. And that premise has been very clearly not been accepted by the Métis Settlement General Council. And it shouldn't have been characterized that way. And so I can't help but wonder, what were the discussions that took place between the Minister of Indigenous Relations and the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction? What was his input? Somewhere in all those meetings, there must have been a discussion about that and some feedback about how they felt the bill being characterized like that. we've seen, you know, these hand-me-downs from other ministries around red tape. I'm curious then, if there's some red tape reduction within this bill, why wasn't that passed off to the red tape reduction minister? Like we've seen before. Or is this actually a case of red tape reduction actually being able to be administered through each individual ministry, thus not even needing the red tape reduction ministry? We could save Albertans $10.5 million. So rather than waiting, should have paused the discussions on this bill as soon as you heard President Lair say, hang on, we have a problem. So if you want to talk about being respectful, start listening to what your number one stakeholder is telling you. They're not in favor of the bill. It brings in changes they don't want. It brings in changes they didn't ask for. And the ones that they did ask for is not reflective in the bill. You need to go back and try a little bit harder. You know, I've always talked about how there seems to be two different things here. You're either consultate or you're consultold. This seems a little bit like consultold, Mr. Chair. Start listening, start incorporating what it is they are asking for. And you'll have a piece of legislation that will probably be supported by all members of this House, including your number one stakeholder, the Métis Settlement General Council. So hopefully, throughout the committee of the whole here, we'll have maybe some opportunities to take advantage, get proper input, and make a piece of legislation that we can probably support. Because as Bill 57 is proposed right now, especially with those amendments, and I know my friend from Highlands Norwood mentioned this, around changing the number of members. That in itself is concerning. But, you know, I guess it's not much of a surprise. We've seen this kind of behavior, you know, right here within the legislature and committees and around, you know, limiting the ability of opposition to do its job and messing with quorums and things like that. So I'm telling you, don't mess with this. Do it properly. You have an opportunity here while we're in committee to whole to straighten this out. I hope you'll take advantage of it. But I do look forward to others' thoughts, and perhaps I will rise again at some point in time in committee of the whole to add even further comments, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there members? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to rise in committee of the whole on Bill 57, amendments to the Métis Settlements Act. I want to thank my colleagues for their comments today, especially the member for Lethbridge West, who clearly has done a great deal of research and studying and has a deep understanding and appreciation of the history of Métis people, not just in Alberta, but across Canada, and she really brought that knowledge to this discussion today. And I'd like to pick up on that a little bit, not to the same depth that my colleague from Lethbridge West was able to do, but it's simply, I want to respond in some ways to the comments that we have heard today from ministers on the government side with respect to the concerns that are being raised on Bill 57. Now, I think most Albertans have become quite used to the fact that this government proceeds without much concern or care for key stakeholders on many, many issues, whether that be with doctors and nurses in healthcare reform. Certainly, I have firsthand knowledge of that in my role as critic for Children's Services, to how the interests and needs of childcare educators and childcare providers have been ignored by this government when it comes to the changes that have been made and the cuts that have been implemented on the early learning and childcare system and the implications for that. And certainly within the realm of education, we see that over, I think it's close to 40,000 teachers can be dismissed with a wave of a hand by this government. Teachers who have been standing up, working day in and day out, live in our communities, educate our children, are part of our communities, and have done heroic work over this past year, how easily this government dismisses what they say and call them names and, do their typical government thing. So certainly we're well used to in this province the dismissal by this government of key stakeholders on various issues. However, what is distinct about what we're talking about here with Bill 57 is that the Métis Settlements General Council has raised significant issues about the process, the consultative process that led to this bill being introduced in the House. And where this is different than even the other egregious examples, coal, parks, I mean, there's too many to list, Mr. Speaker, but is that the Métis settlements and the Métis people of Alberta are not just stakeholders that this government can ignore. There's actually unique responsibilities that hold the government to account to actually engage with Métis people of Alberta in a very different way than just an ordinary stakeholder. And that is because of their unique and status within our country as part of Alberta, part of Indigenous peoples of Canada and Alberta. And in fact, there are legal obligations to consult that are triggered by the type of legislation that we're seeing here that are different. Certainly, as much as it might outrage thousands of Albertans, and as much as we know that the way the government has proceeded with a number of pieces of legislation with earplugs in and ignoring the concerns of thousands of Albertans, that is actually their right to do as government. They can certainly and will be held accountable, and we see that reflected in the confidence that Albertans have in this Premier and this government right now, and they will be held accountable, but certainly they can proceed with legislation, as we've seen them do many, many times, without caring about the implications on key stakeholders and on Albertans. They cannot do the same when it comes to legislation that affects First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people in this country. They actually simply cannot. They have legal obligations to consult in a meaningful way. And the member from Lethbridge West rightfully raised that this is an issue of the honor of the Crown, which triggers that obligation to consult. And so when we stand in this House and we've raised concerns about Bill 57, I understand the instinct from the government just to get up and think it's just the NDP complaining, and of course we know what they think of that and what they think of us. But on this matter, I'm a little bit confounded that they don't understand that what we're talking about here, the concerns we're raising, are not coming from our position as a party or our ideological positions or whatever they think drives what we do as what appears to drive them. But this is actually, we are reflecting what we're hearing from the Métis Settlements General Council. And they're saying, we were not properly consulted. And unfortunately, this government cannot dismiss that the same way they dismiss other stakeholders on other pieces of legislation. They actually have a legal obligation to engage and to enter into meaningful consultation. And unfortunately, it's not solely up to the discretion and determination of the Minister of Indigenous Relations or any other Minister of the Crown to say that consultation was enough. The courts have said that is not a fulfillment of the duty to consult. And in 2016, I appreciate there's been some gray area for some time, or certainly not for all perspectives, but certainly there's been some gray area around the duty to consult for Métis people. But in 2016, there was the landmark decision in the Daniels decision from the Supreme Court of Canada, which really seemed to answer, maybe not definitively, there's certainly a lot of questions that still raised from that decision, but it certainly recognized that the Métis people are recognized within Section 91, Sub 24 of the Constitution, which gives and triggers that honor of the Crown and fiduciary obligation that goes along with that relationship between the federal and provincial governments and First Nation, Métis, Inuit people. It triggered that duty to consult. And again, that is a unique duty. That is unique and different than the responsibility that I believe all government should have to properly consult when stakeholders are engaged or affected by possible policy or legislative change. We expect consultation to be part of that for anybody, but this is a unique responsibility. It is a legal obligation to do so. So when we stand up in this House and we say Bill 57 is of concern, it's not of concern because, you know, I'm standing here as the member from Edmonton-Whiteman saying it is. I'm saying that we have heard, the government has heard, it has been publicly stated that the Métis Settlement General Council has indicated that they do not believe they are properly consulted. And the MSGC is the representative organization for the 8 settlements in Alberta. You know, and I understand that 7 out of 8 of those settlements publicly say that they agree with this non-confidence in this Bill 57, one of which refrained from publicly saying that because they're worried about pushback from this government on specific other measures they have before the government asks they have before this government. So it is not simply the opposition saying this is a bad bill, because I expect the government to ignore that. But they should not and cannot legally ignore that it is the Métis Settlements General Council who is saying they have not been properly consulted. And that is really the end of the story, at least for right now. And what I mean by that is that means that the government needs to go back and consult to a point and enter into a fair consultation process. And I briefly practiced in this area, not necessarily with respect to Métis people of Alberta, but I did engage a little bit in this work. And I know that the consultation process is challenging and can be long, and it doesn't necessarily mean that both parties are going to come out feeling like they got exactly what they wanted out of that process. But it's a duty to meaningfully consult. It doesn't mean that a minister can table on his calendar specific meeting dates and say, look, I had this many meetings and therefore I've consulted. No, that's not meaningful consultation under the law. It just simply isn't. And it is not for the determination of this assembly to say whether or not that consultation was sufficient and was adequate. It's a legal standard to be met. And so simply what we're saying is the representative organization for Métis settlements in Alberta have said they do not believe they have been adequately consulted. And that really is the issue. And if the government can choose to barrel ahead, as I'm sure they will, and go forward anyways, and that is the risk that they're taking. But it is our job in this House to stand up and identify those risks, to speak in this House when we have heard from the Métis Settlements General Council that they do not believe Bill 57 appropriately reflects adequate consultation. That is our job to raise that, and we are raising that. And certainly the government has the prerogative by virtue of their numbers to go forward without taking that caution, and Albertans will pay the price for that. And what I mean by that, of course, is yes, it's likely going to lead to legal action. And so the government, I guess, is going to have to weigh those risks. Is it so important that they go forward with this, knowing that those people who they have a legal obligation to consult do not believe they have been meaningfully consulted, and risk legal action and protracted adversarial perspectives on this, or do they want to sit down and meaningfully consult? It's really that easy of a decision. And I suspect we'll get our answer when this moves forward to a vote. But that is, I just simply have to put that on the record, because we hear a lot of response from members from the government side, yelling about the NDP's time in government and all of that, and you know, it seems to be that is their main talking points, Mr. Chair, is they seem to forget that they're government now and have been for 2 years, and it's time to be held accountable for their actions. We're talking about legislation that they've brought forward. We're talking about legislation that the Métis Settlements General Council has said they do not believe they've been adequately consulted. So that's what's up for discussion today. And I appreciate there's only kind of 1 or 2 talking points in their tool belt for the government. But regardless, it's our job, I believe, and I get up many times, my colleagues do as well. We know that we say things that fall on deaf ears or ear-plugged ears, and that's what we do. But we reflect what we hear from Albertans. In this case, we're reflecting what we hear from the Métis Settlements General Council. The government can choose to proceed as they see fit, but it will have an impact on Albertans. It will have an impact on Métis people in this province, and I do believe they would be wise to take that caution, sit down, meaningfully consult, get the Métis Settlements General Council on side. It's not always necessary to do things with a big hammer. Sometimes it's okay to actually sit down and listen to people's concerns, engage, make changes, have everybody on board, and move forward. That is a way that we can be making decisions in this province. It is possible. I invite the government to consider that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I see the Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and Status of Women has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm just curious about meaningful consultation. I'm wondering how meaningful the consultation was when the NDP drained hundreds of $millions out of the fund. I'm curious about that. I'd love to know how meaningful that was to the folks of the Métis settlements. Hundreds of millions of dollars drained away from the Métis people. I'd like to know about meaningful consultation on carbon tax. That would be really great. Love to hear about that. But more than that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to know. You know, in terms of what the NDP is talking about, this is about sustainability. This is about Métis settlements being able to collect monthly fees for water and sewer. This is about essential services. It's also about accountability, just like any government. Governance requires some form of accountability. This is about making sure to have bylaws for them to elect their chairs. These are all really, really important things for the settlements to be able to have the independence and the autonomy in order to be able to run their governance. But the unfortunate thing that the NDP keeps forgetting is that they were in control of that. They liked having control over that. They bled hundreds of millions of dollars out of the fund away from the Métis people. And you know, the members keep talking about the council. That's great. That's one portion. But what about the people who actually live there? Those consultations are just as important. And just remember that for every council member, there's also people that live in those settlements that also have a voice, that also deserve to be represented by the governments that represent them. So I would like to make sure that the people in this province don't ever forget that the NDP government is responsible for bleeding that fund almost down to nothing, with absolutely zero accountability, because they were in charge of those dollars, zero accountability to the very people that are represented in those Métis settlements.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Are there any members wishing to join debate? Seeing none, are you ready for the question on Bill 57, Métis Settlements Amendment? I see the Honourable Member for St. Albert has risen to debate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of comments. I'm not going to respond to that because it's the same as what the minister said earlier. So I'm just going to focus on reiterating some of the comments that my colleagues have made. And, you know, it's a theme, and I think that my colleagues have been very clear, it's been repeated a number of times, that the people who will be impacted by this legislation are not okay with the way it is. They have expressed it a number of different ways. Their dissatisfaction with consultation. And this government just is unwilling to listen. They know better. They think a tour, 19 stops to have a little visit with people, or that qualifies as consultation. It does not. That's not coming from me. That is coming from the people whose lives will be impacted, as the minister suggested. But this is a theme. We have seen this over and over and over again. Government claims to consult. I don't know if they have some sort of checklist. Meeting done, sure. Reached out to one person, sure. Tweeted about it, sure. The fact of the matter is, true consultation requires a relationship, a shared goal, requires listening. Sometimes it requires you meeting in the middle. It requires listening to what people are saying. Clearly, this government is incapable of doing that. I was glad that my colleague brought up what happened earlier today when the Premier just dismissed the voices of thousands and thousands of educators in this province who voted, who said, we do not have confidence in the education minister. And then he boasted saying that, well, education minister must be doing something right, and then sort of giggled about it. that just is so dismissive and so disrespectful. So I am not surprised that with the tone set at the top the way it is, that we're getting a piece of legislation like this, and that we're having a minister of the Crown stand up and say the ridiculous things that she just said. So, Mr. Chair, I will, again, just reiterate my profound disappointment, again, with this government and their inability to actually listen to Albertans in order to get it right. And with that, I will take my seat. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any other members looking to join debate? Are you ready for the question on Bill 57, Métis Settlements Amendment Act 2021, on the clauses of the bill? Are you agreed? Any opposed? That is carried. On the title and preamble, are you agreed? Any opposed? That is also carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? Any opposed? That also is carried. Honourable members. Well, we gotta, perhaps somebody has to get up. I see the Honourable Government Deputy Whip has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the committee rise and report Bill 56 and Bill 57.
Having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika, are you agreed? Any opposed? That is carried. Drumheller-Stettler has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Committee of the Whole has under consideration certain bills. The committee reports the following bills. Bill 56. The committee reports the following bills with some amendments. Bill 57.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried and so ordered. I see the Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika has risen.
Why, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate you recognizing me. I think we've done some tremendous work this week in this legislature, and would like to take this opportunity to thank all members here. And with this, and before I do move that we adjourn the Assembly until, rather, I do move that we adjourn the Assembly until 1:30 p.m. Monday, May 31st, 2021. And with that, I also ask that all members drive safely home to their own constituencies.
Thank you, Honourable Member. All those members in favour of the motion as moved by the Honourable Member for Cardston-Siksika, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried. The Assembly stands adjourned until Monday afternoon at 1:30 p.m.